So welcome back to Module 3, and we're talking about the impact and needs assessment. So this is the way in which you can collect evidence, collect information about what's been happening by way of impacts from the pandemic, from the emergency, from the crisis that have been experienced. What's been the feeling of the community in response to this crisis? And here we're very aware that a whole industry could be built around collecting endless amounts of information about what those impacts have been. And in some cases and in some contexts, that might be absolutely appropriate. But in others, it might be appropriate to take a more, or take a different approach that perhaps is about getting people together in a room to talk about what have been the impacts, and really try to understand those, not as a set, or not only as a set of statistics, but as a set of experiences that communities have felt in this pandemic, in this emergency or crisis that they have been experiencing. So according to our framework, we are now in this sense of Module 3 of assessing and looking forward, so that we can understand what has been that sense. And this is really preparing us to identify recovery activities and renewal initiatives based on what the impacts and needs have been. So again, we're up in this dark quadrant that's highlighted here. But to understand the context of the crisis, David, might need to be some information collected.
Yeah, so it's very much about the experience of the incident, the emergency, the disaster itself. What information exists from the tactical operations, the initial response to the disaster, the emergency. Are there any gaps in your knowledge? Do you need to go out and collect more information to help you better understand what the impacts might have been? Do we have information on a general basis about impacts and needs? Do we need to really hone in onto what we think might have been more disproportionately effective, for example? Or do we simply need to refresh our understanding of what actually emerged during the immediate aftermath of the crisis? But the information most certainly should cover the crisis itself and the response. So what is the story? What do we understand was the situation that developed or unfolded during the crisis? Who were the people, the places and the processes that were most badly affected by it? Who in particular, I think, suffered disproportionately as a result of the emergency or the disaster? And what kind of major impacts or measurement techniques do we need to keep on monitoring the success of any activities you undertake during recovery or indeed renewal to start to address? And of course, as a result of doing that, who are the partners that are most central? Who is it that you critically need to have on board to help you start to address some of those impacts? Can't hear you, Duncan. There's no sound.
Sorry, amateur error. So just to remind you, the 3.2 at the top of the slide says yes, that if you go into the ISO, then you'll be able to find more information about what information you can collect. But just to stay on this theme, if you're commissioning impacts and needs assessment, then what do you commission them on? What information do you seek to find out more about the impacts? And this slide talks about 6 different themes. These themes have emerged through a whole range of research that we've been doing at the university, but focusing on communities and the ways in which communities have been impacted, the economic impacts, of course, and understanding some of the effects on micro and macroeconomics, looking at infrastructure, environment, health, and importantly, what sort of governance impacts have there been, both on your organisations as well as on partnerships, and ways in which those have been disturbed by the crisis that have been experienced. So these 6 themes are places that you might start to collect information. What we're not suggesting is that you need to collect all the information on every theme to the same level and to the same extent, and that each of the bullet points that sit underneath this needs to be done. There will be an extent to which data exists, and that data does not exist, and you're just not able to collect that data. But you can get a sense of the sorts of impacts and but through conversation, through discussion, by talking to the right people, as David's talked about already. But designing an impact and needs assessment, that's what we're talking about in section 3.4, David.
Yeah, so you know, to be clear, you can either do an overarching impact needs assessment or break down individual ones for each of those themes. But either way, I think each one will have a kind of core, criteria, core content. So the first thing I think the RCG will usefully do is agree exactly what the purpose of the impact needs assessment will be, and talk about any refinement or indeed some parameters to make sure that it doesn't get disproportionately big for the effect that you're trying to achieve. But then organize the consultation or information collection, depending which model you're pursuing, define its boundaries, set some time frames, certainly, because you can't, obviously you don't want an open-ended process here, and then select the type of assessment. So is it going to be based on entirely on data collection, or will it include elements of consultation, for example? Then consider the actual losses which might discriminate against prepared communities and poorer communities with fewer assets.
So again, sorry, I moved on 2 slides there. So again, it's about trying to understand what the impacts have been, and making sure that if you have 10 different people all filling in this, that they understand what this impact and needs assessment tool is trying to do. If you're asking them to assess the scale or the scale of the impact, the scale of the loss against any of these, then how do you want them to evaluate that? Do you want them to provide the number of casualties? Do you want to provide the number of evacuees? Or do you want them to evaluate scale on a 1 to 5? And what does 1 and 5 mean? So that there is a consistent interpretation across that, so that you can compare person number 1 who's filling out this with the answers from person number 10, recognizing that they might see this as a way of them being able to influence the importance or the perception of the importance of their own area of interest. So doing that on scale, as well as doing it on the likelihood of the impact, because some of the impacts have already been felt and some of the impacts are foreseen and are expected. But in the ISO, we present and offer this template. The template, not going to go through that in too much detail, but you can see it describes the impact, assesses the impact, and then identifies any actions, and asking the people who are going to fill this in for you to give you as much information about what it is that they've observed, but also what the action is that you might want to take in order to try and undo some of that negative impact, or indeed ways in which that you might want to be able to retain some of the good impacts that have been felt as a result of what's been done during the response. David.
At the normal kind of virtuous cycle, collect information on those impacts, do your assessment, think about it, talk about what you understand the losses to be, whichever measure you've applied, and as long as it's consistent, review that you've got the correct information, you have enough information to be able to make a decision, and then keep on updating assessments and carry on the cycle until you're happy that you have sufficient information on the extent of the needs that remain out there to be addressed by recovery and or indeed renewal.
So section 3.6 in the ISO talks about calculating the economic loss. So calculating and trying to put a pound sign against, or a dollar sign against, what has actually been the impact of the crisis. We have found this to be quite difficult to do in practice during COVID, and we haven't seen places trying to do that. But we recognise that the ISO is not only written for COVID, it's written for a whole range of other emergencies and crises where it might be easier to attribute a financial loss. And so the process would be calculating the loss by understanding what the investment might be in order to mitigate it, in order to put back the conditions that were experienced before the crisis hit, and trying to present the results as to understand what the effect of tangibles, as well as the effect on things that are less tangible and less able to be calculated, but trying to give people quite a well-rounded view of what the impacts have been and what the cost of those impacts would be to put right.
And then I think on this slide, we just wanted to give you an idea of how to present that information. And again, there's too much information on the slide itself to talk you through, but literally, categorizing things into the impact themes, impact areas, and then a qualitative description of how people may have been affected within those particular areas as well.
So, based on this, you can start thinking about, well, what do we want to do to undo the negative effects of these impacts? So what we're going to do to recover, and what do we want to do to renew? So here, RCG can receive the impact and needs assessments that they've commissioned and to understand what those mean. So not only to understand those pound signs, but understand the experiences that people have had, and different experiences, bearing in mind the inequalities that crises often expose and the different experiences that people have had, depending on who they are and where they have been. And now is the time that we can start to identify, well, what might be dealt with in a transactional way, but what needs transformation, much more ambitious renewal initiatives. So it's about selecting action areas to address. And in selecting these action areas, it's about identifying, well, what is the outcome? What is it that we want to achieve by addressing this area? And how likely are we going to be able to achieve that? Everything through to what's our capability, the capacity, what's the effort needed, what's our motivation for change on these particular issues? What's the impact on this if we don't undo the negative impact? And so the impact on our reputation, and how much resource do we need to invest in this? But what is the urgency? What do we need to do now, and what might be left for a later priority? But it's all about trying to understand these areas that we might want to start putting additional effort into for recovery and for renewal. But here's an example David can take us through.
So yeah, there's a breakdown. If we talk about, say, humanitarian assistance, community engagement, impact area, it may have identified an opportunity to capitalise on what the crisis has done that strengthens good neighbourliness, to bond communities through self-generated activities. And they can either be addressed as either transactional activities described as being recovery, or transformational through renewal. So anything from running neighbourhood gatherings to galvanise community cohesion, celebrate the activities in the recovery phase, right the way through to establishing community resilience as a local capability for the next disaster, or to help people prepare better for the next shock that may impact on that particular community. It's just one example, but it's a really useful single example, I think, to break down the detail.
There are other examples in the ISO, but as David said, it's just to give you a sense that the same impact can be dealt with in numerous different ways, either as a transaction or as a transformational activity. But David, I think what we've seen is that impact and needs assessment have very much been the core of many RCGs, but they've been done to different scales and to different successes.
And I think the most important message I think we have for you is it's not an end in itself. It's not about gathering data for an infographic, for example, as effective that is as communicating with the public. This actually is about helping you commission activities, make decisions, prioritize initiatives. I think that's the key message we'd want to take away from here. Don't be frightened by the science of it. Don't get too hung up about the models. It's really about what you do it for and what you're going to use it for, I think, is the critical part of the process here.
And part of it is beginning to form the RCG into an effective operating unit, bringing everybody together onto the same page and helping everybody to understand what the experiences have been beyond their patch. And so I agree with David of, it's got many, many uses, not least just as a conversation piece. So slides are going awry. Where are we? So we're still in module 3, and next module we'll be looking at developing a recovery plan. So again, look forward to chatting with you around module 4, developing a recovery plan, and thank you very much again for listening.